For millennia, transportation on the prairies was focused on its rivers. First by indigenous people, later by fur traders, and it's no coincidence that most of the major cities on the prairies are focused on rivers. And the Red River is a perfect example.
I'm Gordon Goldsborough, head researcher for the Manitoba Historical Society, radio and newspaper columnist, and author of books on the neglected, the overlooked, the hidden places from Manitoba's past. Join me in this series as we explore back roads to places that tell great stories about how things used to be and how we've ended up where we are today. This is Abandoned Manitoba. Today, the muddy Red River meanders quietly through central Manitoba on its way northward to Lake Winnipeg. You may see the odd motorboat or canoe on its waters, but not much else. This was not always the case, though. This river used to be a bustling highway of commerce. For millennia, Indigenous people used the Red River for a travel route. And with the arrival of the Hudson's Bay Company in the late 1700s, the river became a favored place for fur traders aboard canoes and York boats. We pick up the story in the mid-1800s, when steam-powered ships began using the Red River to transport people and goods from American territory in the south into the rapidly populating area that would become Manitoba.
Commerce on the Red River really began to change in 1859. That's the year that the very first steamboat arrived, the Anson Northup. Northup is in fact the correct name. The Northup shown on this commemorative plaque is wrong. The Northup carried tons of supplies here from American territory, but unfortunately its life was short. In 1861, barely 2 years later, it sank in the Red River at Selkirk.
As the size of river vessels increased, it became necessary for bridges over the Red River to be designed to accommodate ships passing underneath. The Bergen Cutoff Bridge is a perfect example. Built in 1913, the bridge was designed with a swing span. Its use discontinued in 1943, the bridge is now forever locked in an open position to accommodate ships that, frankly, are no longer there. I'm heading up the river to continue my exploration. My next stop is the St. Andrew's Lock and Dam at Lockport.
At one time, this site was a major impediment to navigation on the Red River. There was a huge rapids here, and if you wanted to go from Winnipeg out to Lake Winnipeg, you'd have to very carefully weave your way through those rapids. Well, by 1908, the federal government resolved that there really needed to be a better solution, so they started building the very first, and in fact only, lock on the prairies. And the idea would be that essentially it's a water elevator. You would come in from the upstream side into the lock, they would pump the water out to lower you down so that you could then head right out onto Lake Winnipeg. And this essentially made it possible then to easily navigate the Red River, and it facilitated the navigation and the commerce on the Red River for decades to come.
I'm heading further downstream to the city of Selkirk to get a better idea of the size of vessels that used to travel these waters. The Marine Museum at Selkirk has numerous artifacts relating to Manitoba's nautical past, but none are more impressive than the Canora.
The Canora is really the last of the great steamers of the Red River and Lake Winnipeg, but it began its life in 1897 on Lake of the Woods. It spent the first 20 years there until finally in 1917 they cut it in half because it was simply too large to transport in its entirety, and carried the parts by rail to Winnipeg, where for a year it was a floating dance hall. Then in 1923, it began life as a passenger and cargo carrier, picking up things in Winnipeg and carrying them down the river, out into Lake Winnipeg, around the lake, and provisioning the communities all around Lake Winnipeg. In the late 1960s, it was converted from steam power to diesel. Finally, in 1972, having reached the end of its life, it came here and was converted into a museum that reminds us of this way of life centered on commerce along the Red River.
The vessels not lucky enough to be brought to a museum were abandoned along the shores of the Red River. The most famous of these is arguably the Lord Selkirk II. With the decommissioning of the Canora in 1965, there was unfulfilled demand for a ship that could continue to travel Lake Winnipeg and the Red River. A company was formed to raise the $1.5 million needed to build a replacement ship. Construction began in late 1967, and in June of 1969, the Lord Selkirk II was launched. Supposedly the largest ship ever built between the Great Lakes and the Pacific Coast, its life was short. In 1978, less than 10 years after its maiden voyage, and having been a money loser for much of that time, the Lord Selkirk II was sold, then resold. Finally mothballed at Selkirk in 1990, it was subject to numerous acts of vandalism. It was finally sold for scrap and dismantled in 2015. As the role of the Red River as a route for commerce decreased, its use for recreation increased. This was the heyday of the river cruise ships, and they became an instant success after their introduction in the 1960s. These purely recreational ships would ferry passengers up and down the river on sightseeing and entertainment cruises. Author Bill Redekop, who has written 2 books on the subject, has agreed to tell me what made them so popular.
We had this river here, and it was a little more than a sewage dump virtually back then. Maybe I shouldn't say that. And people were discovering the river, in their midst. And it was like this great discovery, and like the initial photos of those crews, they were like these immigrant ships coming into the new world. Like they were like filled, people all along the railings, It was like a big celebration to be on those boats, and they were made tons of money the first years.
My final stop is slightly downstream from the Marine Museum, at a site called the Selkirk Slough, the final resting place of cruise ships. I'm going to see if I can get close to one of the last large riverboats outside of a museum in Manitoba, the River Rouge.
I'd really like to get out there to see the old River Rouge, but I don't want to wade out to it, so I think I'll inflate my kayak and paddle out to it.
In 1966, businessman Dan Ritchie decided to get into the business of operating a cruise ship on the Red River. His 400-passenger River Rouge, allegedly built at a cost of $500,000, would feature a modern, streamlined design compared to competing ships that were meant to resemble stern-wheeling steamboats of the past. Launched on its maiden voyage in 1967, the River Rouge was advertised as Canada's largest and fastest cruise ship. Operated until 2014, the ship was moved to the Selkirk Slough, where it has sat, tied to shore, for the past decade.
I don't see any real obvious structural damage that would prevent it from ever being used again, but it sure would need a lot of TLC to put it back in the river, you know, actually being used again. It's sad because, you know, for a few decades, this was the center of entertainment from people all over the place. To see it sitting forlornly abandoned here in Selkirk is really quite disappointing. You know, I think the era of the recreational riverboats is truly over. You know, to see this ship the way it is now, I think that it's the end. I don't think we're ever going to see their like again. The Bergen Cutoff Bridge is permanently open for ships that'll never come. The St. Andrew's Lock passes a fraction of the traffic that it once did. The commercial ships are sitting in museums. The recreational riverboats either scrapped or pulled up on shore where they're rusting away. The days of the Red River as a commercial corridor are over.